The Forgotten Factory, a tale of urban exploration gone wrong. Urban exploration, the thrill of uncovering forgotten places, can often be a gateway to history, mystery, and sometimes terror. This is the story of four friends who ventured into a long-abandoned factory on the outskirts of their town, seeking the adrenaline rush of exploring the unknown. What they found was something far more sinister than they could have ever imagined. The beginning. It was a chilly autumn evening when Jason, Emily, Marcus, and Sarah decided to explore the old, abandoned factory. The building had been left to decay for over 30 years, its history buried under layers of dust and rust. The factory had once been the beating heart of the town, a textile mill that employed hundreds before a mysterious fire shut it down overnight. Rumors swirled that the factory was cursed, that the spirits of those who died in the fire still lingered within its walls. But the friends didn't believe in ghosts. They were modern, skeptical, and curious. The idea of exploring a forgotten piece of their town's history was too tempting to resist. Armed with flashlights, cameras, and a couple of crowbars for breaking into locked doors, they set off just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The approach. As they approached the factory, the air grew thick with an unsettling silence. The building loomed over them like a sleeping giant, its windows shattered, its walls crumbling. Vines and weeds had taken over the exterior, twisting and curling around the rusted metal. The front gate, which had once barred entry, was now barely hanging onto its hinges. Jason, the unofficial leader of the group, pushed open the gate, the rusty metal groaning in protest. They walked through the overgrown courtyard, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dead leaves that carpeted the ground. The factory seemed even larger up close, its shadow stretching across the yard as if trying to swallow them whole. "Are you guys sure about this?" Sarah whispered, her voice tinged with unease. "Come on, it's just an old building," Marcus replied, though even he couldn't hide the nervous edge in his voice. "We'll be fine." Entering the factory. The main entrance was a massive metal door, once painted a vibrant red but now faded and chipped. Jason gave it a shove, and it swung open with a loud creak. Inside, the darkness was almost impenetrable, only a few beams of moonlight slipping through the broken windows. The air was stale and thick with dust, carrying the faint scent of burnt wood and chemicals. Emily flicked on her flashlight, sweeping the beam across the room. Rows of old, rusty machines stood like silent sentinels, their once industrious purpose long forgotten. The walls were covered in peeling paint and graffiti, the floor littered with debris. "This place is huge," Emily said, her voice echoing in the vast, empty space. "Let's stick together," Jason advised, though he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The shadows seemed to shift and move at the edges of his vision, but every time he turned to look, there was nothing there. The first oddity. They began to explore, moving cautiously through the factory's many rooms. The building was a maze of hallways, staircases, and storage areas, each one more decrepit than the last. As they ventured deeper, the atmosphere grew heavier, as if the very walls were pressing in on them. In one of the rooms, they found old ledgers and documents scattered across a desk, yellowed with age. Marcus picked up a book and flipped through it, but the pages were brittle and fell apart in his hands. "Looks like this place was just left in a hurry," he said. "That's what's so weird about it," Sarah added, glancing nervously at the door. They didn't even clean up after the fire, but it wasn't just the state of the factory that was strange. As they moved through the building, they began to notice odd things: a door that was slightly ajar when it should have been locked, the sound of footsteps echoing in the distance when no one was around, and a feeling of being watched, as if eyes were following their every move. The sound in the darkness. They reached the lower levels of the factory, where the fire had done the most damage. The walls here were blackened with soot, and the floor was littered with debris. The air was damp, and the temperature had dropped noticeably. As they descended a staircase into the basement, the creaking of the old stairs was the only sound, until it wasn't. They all heard it faint at first, but growing louder. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming their fingers against a metal surface. Jason held up his hand, signaling for them to stop. "Do you hear that?" They all nodded, their eyes wide with fear. The tapping continued, coming from somewhere deep within the basement. Emily pointed her flashlight down the corridor, but the beam couldn't penetrate the darkness. "Let's check it out," Jason whispered, though he wasn't sure why he was whispering. They moved slowly, each step echoing in the empty space. The sound grew louder as they approached a large, metal door at the end of the corridor. It was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness visible through the gap. The hidden room. Jason pushed the door open, revealing a small room beyond. It was different from the rest of the factory cleaner, almost untouched by time. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with jars and bottles of various sizes, each labeled in a language none of them could understand. In the center of the room was a table, and on it lay an old reel-to-reel tape recorder. The machine was on, the reel spinning slowly, producing the tapping sound they had heard. "What the hell is this?" Marcus asked, his voice shaking. Jason approached the table cautiously, his flashlight illuminating the dust-covered recorder. "It's been running for years," he said, disbelief in his voice. "How is that even possible?" Emily moved closer to inspect the jars on the shelves. "These look like samples or something. Maybe from the factory's experiments, the tape recorder suddenly clicked, the reel stopping. The room was plunged into an oppressive silence, the kind that makes your ears ring. And then, from the shadows, a voice crackled from the recorder, distorted and garbled, but unmistakably human. "Get out, before it's too late." The descent into madness. The friends froze, the blood draining from their faces. Sarah clutched Marcus's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "We need to leave," she whispered urgently. Now Jason nodded, unable to speak. He grabbed the tape recorder, something compelling him to take it with them. Even though every instinct told him to leave it behind, they turned to leave the room, but as they did, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Emily screamed, dropping her flashlight as the room was plunged into darkness. The sound of frantic breathing filled the air as they scrambled to find the light. Jason fumbled with his flashlight, finally managing to switch it on. But when the beam illuminated the room, they saw something that made their blood run cold. The shelves were empty, the jars and bottles gone. The walls were no longer clean, but covered in rust and mold, as if decades of decay had happened in the blink of an eye. And the door was gone, replaced by a solid wall of bricks. The chase. Panic set in. They pounded on the walls, searching for any way out, but there was none. The room had become a tomb, sealing them inside with whatever malevolent force resided within the factory. And then, from the darkness, they heard the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from somewhere beyond the walls. The friends huddled together, their backs against the cold, unyielding bricks. "Please, let us out," Emily cried, her voice breaking. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they seemed to be just outside the room. And then they stopped. For a moment, there was silence, and then the voice returned, echoing through the room. "You shouldn't have come here." The wall behind them began to shift, the bricks crumbling away to reveal a narrow passageway, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Without thinking, they scrambled through the opening, desperate to escape the nightmare. The factory's secret. They emerged into another part of the factory, a room that appeared to be some kind of office. But this room was different, untouched by the decay that had consumed the rest of the building. Papers were neatly stacked on the desk, and a single, flickering light bulb hung from the ceiling. Jason dropped the tape recorder on the desk, his hands shaking. "We need to find a way out of here," he said, his voice tight with fear. But as they searched the room, they found something even more disturbing. A series of old photographs, pinned to the wall, showed the factory workers smiling, happy, before the fire. But in the background of each photo, barely visible, was a shadowy figure, its face obscured, watching the workers with cold, dead eyes. "What is that?" Sarah whispered, pointing to the figure. "I don't know," Marcus replied. "But I think it's still here." They continued to search the room, finding a journal tucked away in a drawer. The pages were filled with the frantic scribblings of someone who had clearly lost their mind. The writer spoke of the factory being built on cursed land, of strange occurrences and disappearances, and of a dark presence that had taken root within the walls. The final confrontation. As they read the journal, the temperature in the room began to drop rapidly, their breath visible in the air. The light bulb flickered and then went out, plunging them into darkness once more. The sound of footsteps returned, this time faster, more urgent. "We need to go," now Jason shouted, grabbing the tape recorder and the journal. They fled the room, racing through the factory's labyrinthine corridors, the sound of footsteps echoing behind them, growing ever closer. The factory seemed to shift and change around them, leading them deeper into its heart instead of toward the exit. Finally, they burst into a massive, open space, the factory's main production floor. But instead of the rusted, broken machines they had seen earlier, the room was filled with brand new equipment, humming with life. The factory was no longer abandoned, it was alive, and it was angry. At the center of the room stood the shadowy figure from the photographs, now fully visible. It was tall, its form shifting and changing, its face a mask of darkness. It raised a hand, and the machines roared to life, gears grinding, belts spinning, as if the factory itself was preparing to consume them. The escape. Chape. With no other choice, they ran, dodging the whirring machines and falling debris. The factory seemed determined to trap them, its doors slamming shut, its walls closing in. But they didn't stop, driven by sheer terror. Jason spotted a staircase leading up to a catwalk, and they raced toward it. The shadowy figure followed, its presence pressing down on them like a physical weight. They reached the top of the stairs and bolted across the catwalk, the floor trembling beneath their feet. The factory groaned, the walls cracking, as if the entire building was about to collapse. At the end of the catwalk, they found a window, its glass broken and jagged. Without hesitation, they climbed through, ignoring the cuts from the shattered glass, and leaped to the ground below. They hit the ground hard, rolling to a stop in the overgrown courtyard. Behind them, the factory shuddered, the shadowy figure standing in the broken window, watching them with those cold, dead eyes. And then, with a final groan, the building collapsed in on itself, a cloud of dust and debris rising into the night sky. The aftermath. They didn't stop running until they were far from the factory, their breath coming in ragged gasps, their bodies bruised and battered. When they finally looked back, the factory was nothing more than a pile of rubble, its dark history buried once again. The friends never spoke of what happened that night, but the experience haunted them for the rest of their lives. Jason kept the journal and the tape recorder, but he never listened to the tape or read the journal again. Some things, he decided, were better left forgotten. But the nightmares persisted. In their dreams, they were back in the factory, the shadowy figure chasing them through the endless corridors, whispering in the darkness, reminding them that they had escaped, but not for long.